Happy Wednesday. It's time for Business Analysis Live. My name is Susan Moore. I'm the Community Engagement Manager here at IIBA.
And my name is Scott Bennett. I'm the Manager of Business Analysis here at the International Institute of Business Analysis. And today we're talking about when do you do business analysis planning?
And we have a guest. It's always fun when we have a guest. We have Hans Eckman today. Hans, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I speak at conferences across US and Canada, publish articles on my website as well. And I'm currently serving as a principal research analyst with Infotech Research Group. I worked many, many years as a business and system analyst before I realized that was the name for my affliction, and have been really close to the community ever since.
If you missed today's live broadcast, you can also send us an email at live@iiba.org, and we will answer that question through an email, or we'll answer it right here. So, all right, business analysis planning. Well, let's take it from the top. We had Rylan Layton come a couple of weeks ago and talk about business analysis planning. This is kind of his thing, business analysis planning. And, I think one of the myths is that, well, you don't really need to do it. So let's start there. Why do you need to do business analysis planning?
If you've never been introduced to the topic of business analysis planning, you might naturally think, oh, you do all the planning at the start of whatever you're working on. And that's not necessarily the case. So today we're going to demystify maybe that thought. But if we talk about planning from the start, what are those things you need to plan about business analysis and the work you've got coming ahead? It can be as planning as short as 2 weeks, but our role is really to work with people. This is a relationship type of role. So you can't really do things spontaneously unless your team is set up to do that. So when you think about it, you need to meet people, you need to figure out what you need to do and plan that work with them.
If we're cooking, don't we have a recipe? Don't we have a logical sequence? And so we can trick ourselves, especially if we move into agile teams and say, well, I just know how to do this. I'm just going to go and start doing it. And you might be right, but how do your teams know what you're working on, when things will be ready? Are you prioritizing or sequencing things that make sense for them? Or are we creating a work stoppage because items they need or clarifications aren't ready? So to me, it's a continual process. It's not just putting things on a calendar, putting them on a time frame, throwing them on a schedule. It's a continuous reprioritization, almost as if you're the product owner for the requirements. How do you reprioritize based on what the team needs and what's going to deliver the most value?
That's a really great point. And I also think that inevitably, as a business analyst on a project, you are faced with the question, when are you going to be done? And your plan can help you know the things that you have got to do so that you can tell somebody, I will be done when I've got these things completed. So it's a good move just to cover yourself with the things you have to do.
Think about it through the project life cycle as well. So my background is traditional waterfall, planned approach on things, and there is a lot of planning up front. But as you're going through, there's also important stages that you need to plan through. So you're going through and say you've got your requirements signed off. Well, there's still change controls that come through. There's still testing that needs to be planned for, working with stakeholders, tracing those requirements. So it's not just a plan, like Hans said, and not just a plan and then you run it. It's a continual, where am I? Where do I need to go? Who are the people I need to work with? What does success look like?
You both brought up a great point. Requirements are never done. They're never perfect. They're never complete. And we would be silly to try and make 100% complete requirements because the cost versus the benefit isn't there. But as part of your planning, what's your definition of done? Based on the risk or complexity, what level of detail, what level of analysis, what level of documentation is needed? And is the team going to accept that? Does that give them the handoff so that they're ready and can take their part of the work? So if nothing else, just defining the sequencing and your definition of done before you're going to move on is critical to successful requirements management.
Another question that I know that we got in that webinar was, how formal does that business analysis plan need to be? Because I think I think that's really what people react to is, oh my gosh, I have to do business analysis planning. So I've got to do Gantt charts and work breakdown structures and all that. So what do you guys, and Hans, we'll start with you. What do you recommend on formality?
Well, it needs to be at least 1,000-page document in Latin. And if you're doing business in Quebec or Montreal, it also needs to be in French. But the reality is, your level of diligence, your level of work should be adaptive. It needs to scale to the complexity and the risk of what you're working on. I could legitimately hand requirements over to somebody on a napkin if we're really familiar with it. Now, trying to save or store that napkin's not very handy, but I can add the level of details into whatever work management or requirements management tool system of record we're using. If I'm doing something that's really complex, high risk, transactional, then I need to put more diligence into that. I need to have something that can be reviewed, can be archived as a point of time, and then used for impact analysis as we changed before. So I would say scale to the level of your risk, build out your plan based on the level of risk, and find your audience is your developers, your stakeholders, your product owners. What are they familiar with? What are they comfortable with? Because this is partially for you, but it's mainly for them to know what's going on and how you're working so that they can be ready to take that hand off.
That's a great explanation. I love your
Yeah.
description of managing for risk. And I'll just put a little more color to that for those people who are not familiar with that. If you've got something where you're time bound and that delivery date is critical because you're meeting a bunch of expectations, that time bound element is what you need to be working towards. How are you going to guarantee you're going to hit that timeline? Well, you're not going to do that on the back of a napkin. You need to make sure you got the right people involved, the right deliverables, the right amount of contingency in there. Whereas if you're working with something that's maybe taking a month long, I might use just a sheet of paper and jot down, hey, here's the 8 things I need to get done because I'm only working with 2 people. I don't need to invest all that time and effort to build out this wonderful looking plan because really that effort is not justifying the time.
Another dimension to this, I think, is also the amount of stakeholders that you might have to interact with. So some of the very last projects that I did as part of, so I've worked a lot with commercial off-the-shelf projects. And so typically, we are going through entire organizations and needing to get folks' expertise on this work. And inevitably, that means we're taking people away from their day jobs. And so for us, that business analysis plan also could help those managers and executives understand what's the commitment I need from your folks in order to contribute to this project. So think about that too. I think that that is along the same lines as scale, but also if you know you've got to talk to a lot of people, that's where your planning can help to make sure that you get the resources you need or you can negotiate, whether it's finding delegates or reprioritizing pieces of that. So that's, I think, what can be really helpful.
If you are listening live, please ask your questions. We're waiting on those. And if you're listening to this in our podcast or on YouTube, you can ask them in the questions or send them to our email box.
So stakeholders are primarily concerned with when certain features, functionality, capabilities are going to be done. So that's going to be their focus. The development team is really focused on when are they going to have the pieces that they need to assemble. Your project manager or scrum master is going to be looking at that sequence and alignment and also looking for blockers. So you can still have the same information, but tune it to your audience because truthfully, we want to keep the stakeholders out of the weeds as much as possible. And the development team needs an overview, but they're really concerned about those details. So let's try and focus that planning around getting them what helps them make decisions and sequence their work most effectively.
I'm wondering, Scott, you and I laughed at the same point, and I am wondering if it's because sometimes those business analysis plans, if you are too very detailed, what ends up happening is your project manager or some manager says, well, do you really have to do 5 use cases? Can you just do 2? And you really get into negotiating really deep in the weeds. So, I know Ryland gave an example in his webinar that he did, and he said, sometimes it's just an email. It's just an email with a couple of bullet points for that audience because that's what they need to know. You're really not looking for people to start nitpicking your plan. So that is another great tip.
So I've got
write
a
it for
question
your
for
audience.
both of you. Do you
Yeah.
need to have formal training in planning to be good at doing business analysis planning?
You know, I was raised with project managers, so it's just, it's just who I am these days. Um, and also because of the kinds of projects that I've worked on, largely commercial off the shelf, there is a lot of planning that goes into that. But I don't ever recall getting any kind of formal planning. I learned that not having a plan can really hurt you. So that's probably how I learned. Hans, what about you?
I think we have an innate ability from planning because we've learned it throughout our lives. We've seen it in our work lives, especially. So I would call that the easy path, the things we know. The advantage of training or reading, learning from other ways is you're validating and you're using those tools appropriately. And you're discovering better ways to plan, manage information, communicate, stay on top of it, maybe balance out or prioritize work. So the more you have breadth and depth in your toolbox, you'll not only be more effective on your immediate project, but you'll probably have a lot more assets to bring to really cool initiatives that may pop up. It may be things that help you get promoted, or whether it's to a level of seniority or into a thought leadership role. That breadth and depth from training, from experiences like watching this, from going to the Babok and other assets that the IIBA makes available, is a great way of improving your skill set.
I see we've got some questions coming in. Do you want to pick one, Susan, and maybe we'll start with that?
Yeah, let's start. Well, here's the first one that came in. All righty. How do you deal with high-risk stakeholders who tend to resist change, thereby slowing down the project or having high tendencies to stop the project due to, you name it, laziness, pride, fear of losing control, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah. So, Hans, what do you think?
So our approach at Infotech is more than just building a stakeholder map. It's prioritizing your stakeholders and building a stakeholder management plan. We need to focus the most attention on the stakeholders who have the highest influence and the highest impact to our area. The others we may want to keep informed, other influencers we may want to engage, but we really need to focus and prioritize. So with stakeholders, I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is we accept accountability when they're accountable. If they are not going to make a choice, if they are not going to sequence, if they're not going to do it, then we need to give them a choice. If that's the case, then here's what the result is going to be. If you don't make the decision, here's what the case is going to be. They're accountable for that. We're not. So give them the options, let them choose, document it always, and say, we're moving ahead. This is going to cause a 4-week delay in this particular cycle, but we'll be able to deliver this. Like, always be positive, put it in that sort of fashion. And then also, I'd say the other kind of side trick when we talk about our toolbox, if you can find people that stakeholder trusts, influencers or stakeholders to that stakeholder, you may be able to work with them to influence the stakeholder to come on board or understand it. Everyone's acting in good faith. We all want it to be successful. So typically it means they're lacking information or they're lacking the accountability to move forward.
Yeah, and where I've seen these resisting stakeholders in my experience working on large projects, it's typically there's a misunderstanding somewhere. So you initially have a project where everyone's gung ho, yeah, let's go do it. But you might have, for example, an operations manager who's concerned, you didn't get all these functions in, so my team's going to take the brunt of this. So it's really working out, okay, how can we manage the concerns, understand the concerns, and then work through them with the whole group of stakeholders to come to some sort of agreement. Everyone might not be happy at the end of the day, but you're absolutely right, Hans. Someone has to make the decision to move ahead or pull the plug.
These are really next level kinds of business analysis skills that we're talking about here. So if you are new in the role and you're facing this, consider reaching out to influencers, allies, somebody that can help you in this. If you are, senior in your career, you're a lead business analyst on a project, these are skills that you should bring to the table around how to deal with high-risk stakeholders. And look, there's no training for how to do this. You just have to do it. And you got to find your style, because sometimes this is all about style and how you handle the situation.
Building out
Alrighty.
your soft skills are critical.
Ooh,
Like, don't
boy,
forget
is it ever.
those.
Yeah, boy, is it ever. That's the differentiator. Hans, we often get that question here, how can I take my career to the next level? It's your soft skills. In fact, this might be a good plug, because in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about the top 7 soft skills. So thanks, Hans. All right, so let's get to our next question. How do you stick with the plan when you follow Agile? As there are some times where you get defects while working, and we can't mitigate those defects, so there's no other thing to do but to change the plan. Hans, just you and I are the Agile folks here. So how are you? So maybe let's take it up a level. How are you planning in Agile projects? How are you doing business analysis planning?
So every individual change goes through the same steps regardless of what methodology we use. It starts with a need. We define how to meet that need. We design something that'll solve it. We build it, we test it, release it. We see if it works. Did it move the needle enough? If it did, we're good to go. If not, we need to do something else. Agile simply brings that into smaller cycles. So that planning, that analysis, we shouldn't follow a plan just to follow a plan. What we want to do is that plan needs to adapt to reality. So if you have a change, if you have a constraint, if something comes in, if something just doesn't work, if someone's out sick, then every day I should be looking at my dashboard and saying, okay, how does this affect my plan and what I'm working on? If I need to resequence, what do I need to communicate and who? So in Agile, I'm probably doing that maybe a little more informally and more frequently than I might if I've got more leeway. Like, I'm trying to balance a whole bunch of things over 4 weeks. I've got a little stretch room, but within a sprint, I'm going to have to pay more attention to those disruptions and figure out how to adapt them. How is that mapped to what you've seen in some of your Agile projects, Susan?
Well, in the functioning ones, I think the way that we handled that is we kept our eyes really on the bigger picture, so that we were trying to not necessarily plan out multiple sprints, but we were trying to remember these are the features that we are trying to deliver. And as things were coming up, we were making game time decisions about, okay, well, then do I need to maybe take this thing off the plate? Are we delivering this later? Let's have a negotiation about that. So you really have to be able to sort of work strategically and work tactically at the same time, and flow between them. There was a lot of conversations, I will say that. And in one of I think the best Agile work environments I was in, we would make our plan, but then realize that things changed, and it was always about collaborating and talking about it. So I think it's much the same, and really you tailor it for what your organizations do well. So that's the other thing. We weren't trying to use the Agile ceremonies in order to do this. Like, if something popped up, I went and sat at a manager's desk and said, okay, now what are we going to do? So yeah.
And you should be planning. Typically, I advise anyone to plan at 80%, and then plan out that last 20% for stretch goals or things that you weren't expecting. Because if you plan at 100%, you're always going to be working at 100 to 120%. And that's kind of why we get into this cycle where we think that everything that comes in doesn't affect our date, doesn't affect our sequencing. We just have to absorb it. Ignoring reality like that leads to burnout. And we need to be careful. You are hired to do a set amount of work in a set amount of time, giving your best effort. So it's your responsibility to help work and prioritize that and see what's going to push out. You don't always have to absorb it into your free time and your family time.
Yeah, that's
a good point.
That's right. And I think, we don't often focus on Agile values like trust and courage, but that's where those things come from. You've got to have trust and courage so that you can talk about those kinds of things when they come up. So, alrighty. Next question. So this person asks, we do risk analysis and impact analysis, or you can say feasibility check, but still there are defects while working due to some change in the data. How do you stick to the plan in this case? So they've done everything they can possibly do to come up with all of the different things that might happen, but yet things come up.
Yeah, this
What's
to
the
me
best
sounds
approach?
like traditional project management question versus business analysis planning. But from my experience, you really need to put contingencies in, right? You can't build a perfect plan because it will never go as you plan. So that really comes into, I guess, a risk management technique from a project planning perspective. So this is where you get a project planning professional that will look at what is the contingency, what's the risk factors, how much time do we need to put in for delays and unexpected things. So you always need to expect the unexpected. And if you don't plan for the unexpected, you might be setting yourself up for failure. That's my thought on it.
That should be part of your plan. You're going to have to run clarifications with stakeholders, with SMEs, with developers. You're going to have to address defects. That needs to be part of your time management. So there's a requirements plan, how and what sequence and who are you supporting, but then you also have time management. That doesn't go away. So that 20% or leaving a buffer, if you've got a highly volatile area with a lot of changes, a lot of defects, maybe only half of your time can go to requirements. The rest is going to go to defects, to rework and supporting those teams. That's the reality. And that's kind of where your plan reflects it. And then your time management helps you figure out how to actually get that work done and when.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that you're thinking about what you need to do, but also the time that you're going to need to do it. Very often, here's the conversation that I've had many times in my career. The project manager comes to me and says, "Okay, Susan, you're going to have all your requirements done in 2 weeks." And I think, no, that's not going to happen in 2 weeks. I've got stakeholders that won't even be in the office for a week. And so, those are the kinds of things that you need to not. So to go back to what we were just saying in the prior question, don't try to squeeze that in. It's not feasible. You've got to work through, okay, people are out of the office. That happens. What are the ways that we're going to continue to make progress on my work as a business analyst, but also keep the project moving? So
I'll throw a few more things in here from the BABA guide. If we look at governance, for example, requirements governance, some of the planning you need to do isn't necessarily an activity. It can be, what's the structure? Who's going to be approving this? Who's going to be reviewing it? Who's going to be engaged? Another part of it could be the information management. So where are you storing this stuff? How are people going to have access to it? How are you going to keep it current throughout the life cycle of the work that you're going on? And how do you communicate that? So there's a few more elements rather than just thinking about a timeline as well, in terms of overall planning and monitoring.
that's a good reminder and another plug for the commercial off-the-shelf stuff that I've done. Those are essential parts of your business analysis planning if you are doing commercial off the shelf, because for those projects, you are building, you're really, the asset is already built. You are just putting your business into that box, as I always say. And so you will want to be able to convey requirements information to whether it's support teams, development teams, training teams, and things like that. So, governance and where you're going to put that content is really important to make sure that you talk about. Alrighty, this next question actually is a question for you, Hans. This person is asking for some more clarity on your description of business analysis planning. Does business analysis planning contain some of the business requirements?
I would say your overall plan is detailing your approach, your sequencing or how you're going to prioritize work, ideally some sort of schedule when you think certain things will be done, your definition of done that people are going to accept, and then some method of statusing against that. The content within the plan is going to be the specific work items that you're managing. It could be product backlog, working with a product owner to help get items ready and done, or maybe qualify items that might be in a future. It could be items that you're working on in a current sprint, epics, stories, data models. This is the content that your plan's describing, but your overall plan should be a structure that says from beginning to end, here's my approach, here's how I'm sequencing, here's how I'm laying things out, here's how we know we're done. And then importantly, at the end, here's our requirements change management process. Changes are going to come. Non-material changes, how are we going to adapt them? Material changes that impact development or the schedule, how are we going to deal with those? Be upfront with this, and then that takes away a lot of the ambiguity. So Scott and Susan, how have you helped people or structured your own plans as well?
The ones that are the most complex for me are where I'm managing a team of BAs working across a variety of systems. To me, that whole structure that I put in place with the team it starts with the executives, who's my sponsor, working through understanding who the stakeholders are, the subject matter experts we have access to and permission to talk to, but then working out the team. A lot of the planning that I focus on in a case like that is how we segregate the work and how we bring that work together so it all hangs together in one piece, so we can manage it. I worked on one project that had 100 systems we were impacting. And man, that was requirements traceability. If you've never heard of that term, it saved us in that project because there were so many moving parts to it. So that was a critical part of that plan. But if I look at a smaller piece of work, probably not that relevant. So it really does, the context of the project is really important in understanding that structure.
As you were saying that, I was thinking when you were looking across your context diagram or whatever you were looking across to start out your project, probably as part of your business analysis planning, somebody said, we're going to need to trace these requirements. So that's a great example of how, right? Because I may not have to do a requirements traceability matrix for every single kind of project, but when I have that much going on, that can be a technique that I know that we have to do and to account for. And you really have to account for that before you get into your requirements, because to try to catch up really just takes you away from other activities. Here's what I was thinking of it, and I'm playing this. I'm an audience member right now, and I bet you what they're thinking is, do you mean I have to define like all of the governments and information systems and all of that stuff for every project? And my guess is that you probably don't. And I was thinking, what role could a center of excellence have in this instance of helping to define what I need to do and maybe what I don't need to do as a BA working on my business analysis plan?
Yeah, that's a good question. I stood up a center of excellence in my previous organization. And the smaller organization I found that I work in, the less need for this type of thing, but the larger the organization, the more there is, largely because what we try to do is reproduce success. And when you're dealing with, say, a team of 100 or 200 BAs, if you're able to learn from what works well and put in structure to be able to repeat that success, that certainly helps that. So in a case like that, you might look at what's the budget range, or what are the number of systems range that if you're over this amount, you should be doing X. If you're under that amount, it's optional. So I've seen that in various structures and templates, that really assessing risk to some degree through number of systems or budgets or stakeholders, could be a rule of thumb for that.
Okay.
And
All
think
right.
about what the system of record is. So if you're managing the workflow in a delivery management tool or platform, why would you reproduce it in your and sequencing in your requirements plan? So figure out the level of detail you need. It refers to the work you're doing. It doesn't need to contain every single step, everything you're doing in your work itself. That would end up, I mean, if you need that level of detail and you need that help, do it. But that's probably, call it an appendix to your requirements plan. That's an extra detail for you. Very few people would need to see that level.
Well, let's take this next question then. And we are doing good on time. Okay, so what should I do as a BA? I am preparing my plan. I've got these meetings on the schedule. And now let's say that I've got a couple of stakeholders that suddenly can't meet. Now, this question is, do I postpone or do I go ahead? That's because that comes up So how do you factor that into your business analysis planning?
Yeah, I consider myself a meeting planning expert. The one guideline I would use, the hack, if you will, is plan at least 2 weeks in advance. If you're trying to plan in this current week who you're going to meet with, in my experience working in large organizations and small, people's calendars typically book up. So that's why planning is so important, because if you book 2 weeks out, you've got a much higher chance of being able to reach those people. So let's just work through this scenario. You're planning 2 weeks out. You've got this roadblock. You can't get everyone together. There's a couple of avenues you can pursue. One is email the attendees and say, can you make yourself available at this time? Because some people block time for focus time. The other option, depending on the organization, is you might want to go to the stakeholders, the leadership, and say, hey, we need to get this done. Can we ask that people make the time for this? So you've got that support. Again, it depends on the culture of the organization, but if it's really formal, you might have to do that to get approval to say, hey, we need to have this meeting. Can you make the time?
Well, and this should come up in your pre-planning. So another hack for your toolbox. In pre-planning, before you're going to even start the cycle, determine who you need to meet with and start placing calendar blockers. If you don't need it, you can always cancel it, but trying to find space later is almost impossible. And then in your planning, who is the source of the information, who's reviewing it, and who is the approver. One mistake I've seen a lot of BAs make is we end up trying to go to everything for the stakeholder. Well, we really need to be in front of the SMEs and the end users or customers. So let's define and get that stakeholder to assign or direct us to SMEs and say, I'll review and approve it, but the details you're going to get from them. So you can take them out of the equation until you get into the review and approve stage.
Since we're talking meeting hacks, I'll give you mine. So my meeting hack is I'm identifying all the people that I've got to meet with. I am also trying to uncover if they are absolutely required for a particular topic or if they are optional. And I make sure that it's very clear in the invitation which they are, if they're required or optional. And I also try to understand, particularly for decision makers, if they have a delegate. So in the event they are, because usually the decision makers are the ones that are going to be the hardest to get into a room to meet. So I try to understand if there is somebody else that I can go to who could be their delegate, and then I can make them either optional on a meeting, or if I see that that person is out, then I can include them. So again, that's more stakeholder management, but it is absolutely something that you've got to plan up front. All right,
Yeah.
so maybe this will be our last question here. It's a long one. I created a process map to be able to assess process that doesn't add value to the business during the project life cycle. I shared during the project, they shared a survey among stakeholders to be able to analyze the risk. Some stakeholders kicked back against it because they felt that it would expose their role. So this is, as you're going through this business analysis, so maybe the question is, how do you handle resistance? That's kind of how I'm interpreting that. In your, these things come up, people don't want to participate. So it's not that they're not available, they don't even want to participate.
To me, where people are resisting getting involved, that, in my opinion, that really comes down to a leadership discussion. It's the leadership that is trying to accomplish something. And if there's some resistance partway through, there might be a valid reason for concerns. You need to understand what those concerns, or the leadership needs to understand that. But if there is resistance to a change that the leadership is driving forward, that comes down to change management. And that in itself is a whole bucket of skills that, as a business analysis professional, we can use. But also those leadership people that typically go into leadership have some of those skills because of the nature of what they're working through. So for me, in general, it's relying on the leadership and the sponsorship and the authority to be able to work through those resisting points.
And if people aren't available, that's where you have to reprioritize, resequence those events, communicate it, and make sure it's clear why that happened. The other is, if you have an instance where part of the process, part of the success, that team isn't going to or doesn't want to participate, then that needs to be escalated to the product owner or the sponsor to decide how they're going to handle it. Are they going to help sway and get their participation? Are they going to restrict and we're going to only get a partial solution? But ultimately, if you've got an area that isn't functioning properly and they're trying to hide it, that has to be escalated by senior management and dealt with, because you have not only an active resistor, you have a group that is actively working against the best interests of the organization, and that has to be handled top down. So luckily, you can feed them information, you can help them have that conversation, but that's a conversation that needs to happen with their leadership team to get them on board with what success looks like and how we're going to get there. So having a clear roadmap and an identification of what that success would look like.
Yeah, that's and this I think is a great example of where it's not just recommended that you go and talk to your allies and sponsors and decision makers. This one you really do have to let them know what's going on. So that's a responsibility of the business analysis professional. All right, well, we have come to the end of our questions. There's a couple of topics that we have touched on today that we've got some upcoming webinars on. So we talked about business analysis planning. So that's coming up. It's a member exclusive webinar that's coming up on November 2nd. It's 7 o'clock in the evening, but we're also going to be talking about conducting a change impact assessment. We talked about change management too. So that's coming up in December. And I'm sure Rosalind will drop that upcoming webinars link out there. We also want to remind everybody, we have got Global Business Analysis Day coming up November 1st. It starts at 10 in the morning. It is a free virtual event and we are going around the world. Please join us. And then we've also just introduced our Career Center. There are over 10,000 business analysis jobs out there. You can find that job board at the top of IIBA.org, and I'm sure Rosalind will put that in there as well. I want to thank Hans today. It's been a pleasure, Hans. We're going to ask you to come back, so don't even worry about it. You've got a standing invitation. Join us in 2 weeks. We are going to be talking about something else we talked about today, which is the top 7 soft skills that you need as a business analysis professional. We thank everybody. Scott, thank you again. It has been great to see everyone, talk to everyone, and answer your questions. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and we'll leave another one right here for you to help you in your business analysis career. If you haven't subscribed to the IIBA YouTube channel yet, you can click over here and click on the bell icon to get notified every time we publish a brand new video.